Busby's words. He claims this isn't about publicity while he's publicizing it at a press conference. He claims it's not about money when the system itself is about money. The civil justice system is premised on using money to balance the playing field when the powerful have wronged the powerless.
Every team I've talked to, whether they're interested in watching or not, has put everything on hold because no way he's getting traded by the draft, and there's no way they're going to get for him what they were hoping to do, getting a bunch of different teams bidding against each other.
And welcome to another episode of the Turn Up For What podcast, talking your Houston Texans straight from the Great British Isles. It is not just a defence that's looking rusty as allegations mount, motions are filed, and Caserio keeps on spending. I'm joined by Matt Weston of Battle Red Blog and Battle Red Radio. Matt, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's springtime. The birds are chirping, and the Texans are very bad and maybe dumb. We'll talk more about what we think about their offseason been so far. But despite the state of the football team, at least everything else is very nice outside. Everything else is very pretty and beautiful.
Yeah, well, I think we perhaps can't bury the lead just literally as we've come on. There's some more news of signings trickling down from the team, but I suppose the lead really is the Deshaun legal allegations. Last week, we recorded episode on Tuesday. Last week, they just kind of started to emerge. I think subsequently, there's another 10 names or another 10 cases being filed, and it's important to note it's a civil court. But the Deshaun allegations, you've started to see just in the last hour, his legal team with Rusty Hardman come back and try and put their shots over in terms of what's going to be probably a bitter public battle if it doesn't necessarily go all the way to court.
Yeah, it's bizarre, and I don't know. I know it's something that I don't know really anything at all about at all whatsoever. I don't know really anything at all about the law, and some about sexual allegations isn't really anything one, I know anything about it all, and two, something that I feel like I'm in a position to speak of really at all. So I just been kind of listening to what Mike Meltzer and Steph Stradley have to say, because they're people with law degrees who know a lot about the team, know a lot about the NFL in general. And so I've been kind of listening to them. But regardless of what happens with this, if Watson pays anything out, if it turns out these are just allegations, not true, there's no good end to this story. It's either Watson's reputation's kind of tarnished forever, or it's these people try to make some money or something happen where they're trying whatever the reasoning was for why these allegations came out. I don't, whatever happens from this, there's not a good ending to this, and it's already shown a complicated situation with the Watson trade talks into an even more complicated situation, if that was even possible at all to begin with. And so I don't really have a good feel for it. I don't really know anything at all about it. I just know it's really bad all around. And no matter what happens from this, it's going to be bad regardless.
Yeah, and I think, this team's not been about football for a long time. And I think that's just the depressing reality of it, probably since the Kansas City playoff loss and blowing that 24-point lead. It's just been one thing after another, and it's as JJ Watt said, every week it's something, and it's almost like every day it's something. And I think you're right. I mean, who will know what truly, if it does go to court, or it might be settled out of that to stop it being as messy. But I mean, I just can't stop coming back to the fact, Matt, that Deshaun put himself in a situation that he should never put himself in. And he's got to know better than that. I know he's only a 25-year-old guy, but when you're paid what you are in a position you're in, you've got to have a bit more smarts about you to put yourself in a situation that could potentially, lead to a situation like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know, there's just so many allegations too that it's kind of one of the things that we've learned recently, or I guess I've learned in the past few years, is that if there's any sort of rumor at all, there's usually some kernel of truth to it. And so this whole sort of thing too, whatever he did or didn't do, we don't really know at all, but we do know that there's some level of truth to the allegations that have come out, whether if it was coerced at all or something occurred that maybe typically doesn't occur in an environment like that. I'm not exactly sure at all, but it does sound like something happened there. And like you mentioned, it's not we can kind of think about what somebody should be doing or shouldn't be doing, but regardless of that, like you mentioned, it isn't really a spot where you think you should be in as a 25-year-old, as a professional athlete or anybody in general. Anybody in general being kind of that same spot. It's not something that it's not like an action or like a pursuit that you should really be involved in. Considering what he was looking to do and everything else, but it's all very weird, and I don't really. Again, like no matter what happens out of it, it's gonna be bad. And if I had to guess what will occur, I think he'll probably just pay the money and settle out of court and make sure it doesn't get to that point and go through everything else and try to keep some level of this is what you have to kind of buy, I guess, because of what happened, and try and move on from there as quickly as possible. Would be my guess how this thing kind of turns out.
Yeah, and there's a sworn affidavit from his market manager, Brian Burney, who said that he spoke directly with one of the cases and they asked for $30,000 and all stuff. So I mean, it's going to be a lot of mudslinging and very public, and it's going to damage everyone involved. But in terms of that perception of Deshaun, I think that's, as you said, it's changed forever. And I think in some ways it perhaps deters from his image or his position of, the Texans lied to me. That's why I want out. The whole, almost being the sort of holier than now, the true stand-up character, only wanting to win. I think that image probably now, based on this, has been tarnished somewhat, and perhaps his position as being effusive in wanting a trade it's not all within his control as well. As a secondary point to that image probably being damaged now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like even too, some of those things where it's like, regardless of if it was coerced or if it was forced or anything like that, like still like the messages that have kind of come out and the text messages that have come out as well. Like he's still like stuff happened in that environment. And again, like if you're getting a massage, like you're there to get a sports massage, and that's kind of like how it works. And like athletes pay a lot of money to take care of their body, and that's kind of like a resource and investment they put into their body is by making sure they can recover quickly to get back out there to get through their off-season workouts or be able to play the following week after taking the hits that these guys take. And so I think just even in that situation, it's not something that should really be occurring at all. But I think just for that reason alone, especially with him kind of being like a stand-up, like high character guy, not only just being like a great quarterback and a great player, but he's been like the good soldier. He's been a great teammate. Everybody's had nothing but like beautiful and great things to say about him. And us as fans, like we have nothing bad to say about Watson as a player, as a person. And so this whole thing coming out, it kind of tarnishes like what he had a perfect image, and now like there's like we're all human. There's some sort of crack in that image that we've all had for him, and we don't know these players directly at all. We don't know anything about him directly, but you take a guy who's like, again, everybody has a perfect image of him, and now that's no longer the case after this has occurred, regardless of whatever the end result is now.
Yeah, and I think there's a precedent set, because obviously you've got, in parallel to the civil case, you've got the NFL's investigation, who like to be, have been arguably heavy-handed in their punishments they've handed out in previous cases, and you've got obviously the Ben Roethlisberger precedent as well, which I think was 8 games in that region that he got suspended for, and wasn't actually proven to commit any of the crimes. So what do you think's a more likely outcome now? Being traded, because I think that draft deadline, or the natural deadline that was emerging for the draft, that pressure point's probably no longer there. Do you think it's more likely he's suspended for some of the season than he is traded?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea was that he'd be traded before the draft. They were going to trade him, and by hiring David Coley and by signing Tyron Taylor to the contract that they had, and some of the offseason moves they made too, I think even though there wasn't like a complete unison or like a real like unified goal or plan that they've had from some of the offseason decisions they made, the trades that they made, but like overall, I think all signs kind of pointed to Watson being traded. And like you mentioned, if you're going to trade Watson, it needs to happen before the NFL draft. So that way you know what you're getting for him if you do make that trade. Because again, like draft capital is the most important resource in a rebuild. And so with the allegations that have come out, it now makes me think that I couldn't imagine like Watson being traded before the NFL draft. And I think this is something where he'll be on the roster for probably another year now. I know there's reports like from Peter King, and you kind of see other things on Twitter that this hasn't really dampened his trade value all that much, and teams are still interested in him. And I think they are, but I think it does damper his trade value somewhat. And I think for like the Texans' perspective, if you're going to trade Watson rather than just like pay him not to play this year, you have to make sure you get a package that is worth it. And so I don't really think I think anything that kind of hampers that package too will kind of lead to them maybe holding on to him for another year. And I think in a way, like try to be there for him in the situation that they're in, to try maybe see if that's a way they can get him to stay here as well too, later on as well. But it's just weird because like, again, like it's something that's already complicated without the allegations. Now with the allegations, it makes like, completely zero sense to us, sitting here in front of our computers and phones and just reading the news.
Yeah, and I go back and forth on this in terms of when I first heard the news, I thought, well, this is actually, albeit terrible circumstances, you don't want to make light of any of the, potential allegations. But in terms of football and sense, I kind of thought there's a chance here or there's an opportunity, not that they might be savvy enough to recognise it, but you could make amends and stand by somebody in a time where, their character and their personality was called into question. And regardless of, the validity of that, I don't think the National Football League's probably a place for virtue and morals. And, we've seen that over a long period of time. But there's almost an opportunity here to go to him and say, look, we supported you in the time you need, would that allow you to consider to stay? And I think that's an opportunity for that. So I kind of go back and forth on the point. I think a couple of weeks ago after that David Culley interview, the caretaker Culley, that he sort of slipped up and said right now as our quarterback. But then actually I subsequently listened to an interview with him, and right now is one of his go-to phrases that he constantly uses. I don't know if he was doing that purposely to try and sort of even out the cracks potentially in some of his thinking or his slips that he made up. But at that point, I thought 100% he's gone. The challenges are now insurmountable. But now I thought this would potentially give them a chance to make amends. And because ultimately this team you almost make your peace with it because you feel like it's coming. It's like almost a long-term illness, and it's coming and it's got an end point at some point. You start to prepare yourself. But then the more you think about it, a Houston Texans team without Deshaun is probably not one that's worth anybody's time, effort, and attention for as long as perhaps they search for a player like him prior to this. So is there any kind of potential scenario you think where they can work this out with him in light of the hard time that he's going through right now? And look, he may be proven guilty and his forever tarnish may affect him mentally, so like Tiger Woods, etc. But I think there's potential opportunity in every kind of dire situation.
Yeah, and like even like the tarnishment thing, like you mentioned about Tiger Woods and Roethlisberger, like everybody knows that those men did that sort of thing, but like if enough time passes, there's always the opportunity for, I guess, like retribution in the public eye. Like even Michael Vick, he was able to sign $100 million contract later on the Philadelphia Eagles, and again, like it's all speculation. We don't know exactly what happened or didn't happen, but I couldn't imagine a world where like Watson is in a spot, from the allegations that came out where he can't play football ever again, or if he's suspended for, if he's suspended, I could see it be for like 4 games or 6 games, and he possibly sells it out of court. Something like that occurs after the NFL does their investigation. But there's always like he'll have the heat and the vitriol for a year or two, and then the door is always open kind of for people to like him again, because that's usually how the news cycles worked. And I know it's a different time now in 2021, but that's usually just how it's always been every time one of these sets of circumstances comes up. But I don't know. Like, I guess the only joke I can make and make light of the situation is at least, thank God Deshaun Watson has Jack Easterby in the building, because this is what Easterby's here to do. And he has, Easterby there who can be able to, help him and guide him in this circumstances like he's guided, Derek Rivers before, or, the wide variety of other players who really like Easterby and the things that he's provided to him too. But I do think like this, I think there's a chance that Houston be able to maybe salvage the situation. But I think it still kind of comes down to the fact that like Watson doesn't want to play for Houston anymore. And I think now, rather than him being traded before the draft, I think he'll probably be traded next year before the draft. And I do think like Houston's set up to be like, a 4 or 5 win team, with Tyron Taylor running like a run heavy offense if it comes down to that as well too. But I still assume that Watson will be traded. Will be traded sometime, whether it's before the draft this year, before the draft next year.
Yeah, I've always thought he'll never sign another contract. It was just how much of that contract he potentially sees out. I think you've got a situation now in the current modern NFL where things are fluid and players want to move, and the people staying with the one club for the entire career is probably a thing of the past. And certainly we've seen change from Caserio's approach to free agency. We've had 4 trades. He's given out over 60 million in guarantees. I think we're at 40 odd transactions. And I don't think free agency took a traditional pattern this year in terms of you have the big signings at the start and then you have, the second, third wave, etc. And I think the suppressed salary caps probably played a big role in that. But the Texans were on their own unique path with Caserio. But as I put in an article on podcasttexans.com this week, I'm not quite clear what his strategy is.
Yeah, I'm not either. Because on one hand, it's well, they haven't gone full rebuild, and at the same time, they have gone full rebuild. They made decisions swapping picks for Marcus Cannon. They made decisions to keep David Johnson here, and they made decisions that are kind of more based around this team this year right now. I think the signing of Tyron Taylor is a great example of having a backup for Watson, but you don't sign a backup quarterback with the ability to earn your $12.5 million unless you're thinking he could be the starter. And so there's this weird gray area from decisions that they made this year. My question for you though, it's I know they've signed a bunch of different players and it's a 1-year short-term contracts, but do you think any of these players are good? Because a lot of people have really lauded and applauded Nick Caserio for the strategy he's taken to sign a bunch of players, to short contracts to try to improve the overall quality of talent on the roster. But I think a lot of these guys aren't very good. So what's your opinion on the players that he's signed so far?
Well, I think everybody's probably suffering, which I looked up this term actually, and I was going to put it in the article, but I chose not to. But I think everybody's kind of under the effect of retroactive interference. And effectively that is when people learn new information. It interferes and impedes with previous information that they can't recall as well. And I think it's just a case of the team has been so poorly run for a good 2-year period. People don't really remember what it's like when Rick Smith managed to trade a tight end for a 7-round pick who never played a down in the league. And make trades that may favour you slightly rather than grossly disadvantage you. So I think there's a sort of a learned behaviour of people that because there was a trade or because there was a signing that we didn't pay well over the odds for, like Eric Murray, Randall Cobb, or we didn't trade somebody and didn't get anywhere near their worth back, that's a good thing. And I think it is in a sense, but that's, it's like saying, well, you did a great job at work because you turned up today. And I don't think any of these guys are good, to be honest, Matt. No, I don't. There's a couple, we can come on to a couple that I think of. But overall, I think you've had guys sign 1- and 2-year deals. And that is partly a league-wide thing because the new TV deal doesn't kick in until 2023. And so there's been a sort of general trend towards that. So there's been short-term deals, and people say, well, he signed a lot of guys on short-term deals, but he signed an unprecedented value. And people go back to, oh, well, the Seahawks did this, and other teams did this. But I think the difference there between the Seahawks doing that was they had their long-term head coach, and I don't think we do.
Yeah, and I think it's a good way to put it. I think it's really people who like this are well, they didn't give Kevin Pierre-Louis, 3 years, $30 million like they gave Eric Murray. They gave him, 2 years, $6 million. And so, or whatever ended up being that's a good contract. And they gave Malik Collins 1 year, $6 million instead of 2 years, $20 million. And they traded a 6th-round pick for, Ryan Lindley instead of a 3rd or 4th-round pick like Bill O'Brien could possibly done. And so I think the bar is so low that even a level of competence, has really been very exciting for a lot of the fan base whenever it comes down to, a lot of these players aren't good. And so the list, I think I have the whole list of it, and I kind of want to read them out just because it really kind of sets the example of just the level of talent here. They signed Tay Davis, they trade for Ryan Izzo, they signed Desmond King, Cole Toner, Cameron Johnston, trade for Ryan Finley. They signed Dante Moncrief, Justin McCray, Joe Thomas, Andre Roberts, Terrence Brooks, Chris Moore, Alex Erickson, Cam McGregor-Hill, Kevin Pierre-Louis, Terrence Mitchell, Mark Ingram, Malik Collins, trade for Marcus Cannon and Shaq Lawson, Seinfeld Lindsay, Tyron Taylor, Derek Rivers, Christian Kirksey, Hardy Nickerson Jr., and Tremont Smith. And like, I think 90% of these guys are bad. They're not really NFL quality, sort of players. And the thing about these signings too that Caserio made, he made a lot of these on the first day. And so he used up a lot of his salary cap space up on the first 2 days by getting players who aren't bad, that you can sign these guys in August. You can sign these guys in July. And like, you don't have to build your entire team in March. You have plenty of time before you can actually build out your roster. You have until September to build your roster out. And like, Christian Kirksey is going to still be there in May. He's still going to be there in June if you can't find a linebacker replacement. But what you do is there's an opportunity cost involved though, because by signing these guys in the first 2 days of free agency, you don't have the same cap space. You don't have the same flexibility to sign the veterans that get released later on, to sign the players that are actually talented to your contracts that you can still get them on, but are just actually like good players. Like Desmond King's a good player. Philip Lindsay's a good player. These are guys that you can sign to short-term contracts like he did, but because he devoted so much cap space and contracts to bad players like Joe Thomas and Terrence Brooks and Cam McGregor-Hill, he lost the opportunity to be ready for the next version of Desmond King whenever he comes along too. And so I do think I like the idea of the short-term contracts and like the short contracts he gave out in this type of year. I just think he went about it too quickly and just signed a bunch of bad players. Some of the opportunities there to sign good players on short-term contracts. Like you saw that with like Larry Ogunjobi just now. You could sign him instead of Malik Collins, or Anthony Walker Jr. You can sign him instead of Cam McGregor-Hill. And there's just a wide variety of examples of guys who are signed to short-term contracts that Houston gave out a similar contract, but just to a player that is going to have a difficult time making the roster in a good team, and is probably like a practice squad caliber player to begin with too.
Yeah, and I mean, there's not a huge amount of guarantees in a lot of these guys, so you can easily cut bait, I think. But as you said, I think not only do you then detract from your ability to pick up surprise cuts, post 1st June, training camp cut downs, there's so many opportunities throughout a long off season to add, and it feels like we've kind of shot our shot really early. But at the same time, when this is quite clearly, or in some instances, we're showing that it is a rebuild, why are we spending right up to the cap and having to restructure multiple deals to get in, 30 sort of tier 3 players? I would have far rather signed 15 or 10 tier 2 players at slightly bigger deals and have actually a bit of conviction in some of the guys you bring in, rather than we're not really married to any of them. And I just don't see why we need to spend the money now, why we're not wanting to roll that into future years when we have a chance of being competitive. Why are we guaranteeing $3 million to a punter? Why are we bringing in a 33-year-old returner, in Andrew Roberts, who has had good years, has been to the Pro Bowl, but, over the other side of 30, legs can go, and you saw that with Whitney Merciless last year. Not the same position or like for like, but it does happen, and people, when they do hit that physical slope, it goes quickly. The average age of people they brought in was 28. As you said, it's about a rebuild is predominantly about getting draft capital and getting younger and letting young guys develop. So in 2 and 3 years' time, when you amass enough talent, then those guys who you groomed in those early years are ready to contribute above their rookie contracts. And it just feels like that I'm confused by what Caserio's things. It almost feels like he's conducting a number of parallel plans because he just doesn't know what's going to happen with Watson in his heart of heart. He's rebuffed every offer reportedly, or every phone call, and he doesn't quite know where that's going to go. He hopes he's going to stay, but he's not quite sure. But then again, it's why we're trading for, Izzo, who's just a wide tight end blocker. You could have picked a guy like that up in the 6th, 7th round this year. Marcus Cannon, you've just spent 3 first-round picks on 2 tackles. Now you've brought another guy who's 33, and you're probably going to have to restructure his deal for him to make any sense for him to be here. So, yeah, I just think there's so many kind of convoluting points of theory that he's applying to his strategy, and I think people are just so in awe of somebody doing a job well, or a job by reasonable general manager standards, rather than somebody who clearly shouldn't be in the role.
Yeah, yeah, and even giving David Johnson, 4.5
Yeah,
million
yeah.
guaranteed. Or now
Or Mark
Buddy
Ingram.
Howell.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have Buddy. So right now you have Buddy Howell and Dontre Hilliard. Both of them have never done anything at all for the team, or just kind of special teams players. You sign Mark Ingram, you devote that salary cap space to David Johnson, and now Philip Lindsay pops up out of nowhere. You sign him too, and you have 5 running backs. It's like you would just be better off having Philip Lindsay on a short, like a 1-year contract, and then just drafting a running back in the 6th round, and then
Huh.
using Scotty Phillips. And they're devoting like $10 million to the running back position on a bad football team, which doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever. Whenever you could have sign us on Reddick for 1 year, $8 million, or whatever the premium you may have to pay to get him in Houston instead. And like you mentioned, the idea in a rebuild, the most important resource is draft capital. And then your free agency, like you still want to spend your free agency dollars, unless you're trying to plan to, roll over in a big contract year, which maybe they may try to do in like 2022. But the second thing is that you want to sign players who are young with some level of like potential. Like I don't think Derek Rivers is good at all, but Derek Rivers was like a good prospect 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and he had his leg, kind of blow up twice. But that's the type of player that you want to take a flyer on, even if he is a Jack Easterby guy, where he was a high prospect, once upon a time, never really developed at all. You have him for a year. He's a lottery ticket. Those are the type of players that you would have. Like Keanu Neal would have been good as a strong safety instead of Lonnie Johnson maybe, or you can even put Lonnie outside cornerback maybe again. But these sort of guys who've already kind of proven themselves, you can sign to a 1-year contract. If they're great, then you can extend them long term for the future. Now that they're kind of part of the core part of your roster, you're not going to get that with Christian Kirksey. You're not going to get that with Kevin Pierre-Louis. You're not going to get that with Greiger Hill. You're not going to get that with Terrence Mitchell. And so there's constantly like all these guys here who won't be a part of the next good Texans team, who you won't be thinking about at all in 2023, and really have like no ability to provide sort of foundation or talent level for the future. Like in a rebuild, that's what it's all about. And so I don't really understand like the need to sign so many veterans on a rebuilding team. And if you're also like trying to win now in this year around Deshaun Watson, these players aren't even good to begin with. It's not like they signed good veteran players that took a short-term contract to play with Watson, the Texans. They just signed bad veteran players, and they got a whole lot of them. And I think they're just going to try to like have them compete this offseason and see who sticks and who doesn't. But it doesn't really lend itself as an effective strategy at all whatsoever.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of guys are. It was almost like they were sending it a template and just fished it around agents and see who got, because the vast majority of them are somewhere between 1.5 to 3 million with 500,000 guaranteed. And yeah, the punter one, Cameron Johnson, I don't get. You've got 3 million guaranteed for him. Terrence Mitchell, 3 million, a guy who they let walk in 2016, who probably should have made the roster. Kevin Pierre-Louis, okay, a guy that potential upside, but he's 30 years old, and you've got Malik Collins. Yeah,
And also Pierre Lewis got benched for John Bostic and Cole Holcomb. He started the year next to Thomas Davis, and they had awful linebacker playing Washington, and then he got benched, their linebacker, and their whole defense kind of took off around like week 10 or so with Holcomb and Bostic in the lineup too. Like he got benched. Mitchell was the starting outside cornerback on a bad Browns pass defense too. But I'm sorry to cut you off.
No. And then you've got, I think, Malik Collins potentially, could you get back to the kind of some of the form he showed in Dallas? Yeah. But I think you've probably got 4 or 5 guys there who have all returned punts and kickoffs at some point, all very much third, even some fourth-rate players in there. We've got the new offensive line coach's version of Brent Kvale. He's bringing in guys that have followed him around, and it's just the guys that when you put out there, what the results are. And I think it's confusing. I think, but moreover that you've got players who just okay, PG Hall bringing them back, great, but yeah, guys like Kruger Hill and Pierre Lewis and trying to work out how you're going to fit all these linebackers, or look, a lot of these guys won't make the roster, but it just feels like there's 500K guaranteed here and there. You just probably didn't need to do this year, and obviously we've had to restructure Laramie Tunsil or just over the weekend there, and now we're looking to then probably restructure more contracts to get everybody into the cap, because just as before we came on, they've announced some, but not all the only big deal they've announced is Tyron Taylor, and the rest they're still having to work the cap to actually announce these signings and keep over. So I just don't see what the need to spend this amount of money on this broad spectrum of players this year. I don't understand that at all. I understand the turnover, but we're not in a position to just fish because we've not got the foundations there. So it seems strange from Caserio, but I think everyone's just so overawed by the fact that we've got somebody that's not making a mess of it.
Yeah, yeah, and again, like these aren't good football players, you know, and so like don't like this. Even if you sign 30 players, if they're not good, it doesn't really matter. And I think like the wide receiver decisions are really kind of frustrating because a lot of these guys are guys that are associated with David Coley. You know, Chris Conley, they signed Andre Roberts, they signed Alex Erickson, they signed Chris Moore from Baltimore. Which would you rather have? Would you rather have Will Fuller or would you rather have Alex Erickson, Andre Roberts, Chris Moore, and Chris Conley? I know I would rather have Will Fuller. And so it's like the entire like bundle of these players aren't worth some of the players that they have kept along with them too. It's like also would you rather have Brandon Cooks or Will Fuller? I'd rather have Will Fuller, who's, you know, younger, a better player, a lot more talented, a lot more explosive. And like it's not like Brandon Cooks doesn't have his share of injury issues or isn't kind of like at the age where we've already seen his speed, you kind of slow down. And he's a player too who I cannot think of a worse wide receiver to pair with Tyron Taylor than Brandon Cooks because Cooks works so well running like deep crossing routes, and you know Watson was able to hit him like in some really impossible throws, and because he has such a small hitbox, because Watson's spectacular, Taylor's a pretty like vague and not very sharp downfield thrower too, and so it's like whenever you bundle all these contracts together into one assortment of like 8 million or 6 million, and you see some of the other players that win that price range, it just doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever. And like rather than focus so much on the quantity, I think they should focus on the quality of the players that they sign. And if their decision was to only stay in that like 1 year or 2 year range, from like 3 million a year to up to 6 million a year, there were a lot better players that they could have pursued in that same contract range from the first day of free agency all the way until August. And instead they got, Cameron Greiger-Hill and the players that we've already mentioned already.
Yeah, I think Desmond King is potentially the best signing at the mall. I think Phil Lindsay's probably the equivalent of that on the other side of the ball. But then you've got, and then I think out the rest of that, I think Malik Collins maybe, but there's just, I don't understand the and it's almost like the layers and layers stuff that O'Brien mentioned, but it's taken that to the extreme, and I think it just seems you've spread all your resources really thinly on guys that have got a limited chance at best of working out. And the vast majority of these guys, by their age, by the number of teams they've had, the vast majority of them have had 3 or 4 teams in the last 3 or 4 years. And so the league's worked them out by now. And I would much rather have had the biggest undrafted free agent class we could have had. But we probably can't afford that now with the cap. And they're going to have to continue to clamour to get under the cap. And we'll see that hopefully. I think the guy Jordan Jenkins potentially could be a good edge rusher. And when I say good, I mean good for this defense, not good in terms of pro football terms. And I think the only trade of those trades that I think you would do again, or certainly I'd agree with, was the Shaq Lawson one, because that's a genuine NFL caliber player we're going to add to a team that's transitioned to a 4-3. And McKinney was a guy who you were probably going to have to cut because you overpaid Zach Cunningham in a contract that he then, imploded in terms of his standard of play. So therefore, it forced you to release McKinney, or certainly you're going to struggle to justify paying both those guys. And he wasn't really a fit for a 4-3. And you bring in a player who actually could make your new system better. I think that's probably the only move that I would say is a genuine, solid step forward for the football team.
Yeah, I like that. I thought that move was fine because you're just changing, a position you already have a linebacker for a position of need, which is pass rusher and Shaq Lawson. And Lawson's a good pass rusher. He's not the best pass rusher on a good pass defense. He's probably like you want Shaq Lawson to be your third best pass rusher, and he's already immediately the Texans' best pass rusher. Like it just says a lot about the state of the Texans' defense since they've lost their entire collection of defensive, like their top talent, their top starters. From the last 3 years or so there. But I mean, I think Lawson will be good. He's like strong. He can rush inside and outside. He has long arms. He has the athletic ability to make plays on the edge as well too. I don't mind the Cannon trade. It's just kind of weird to like do that for a 33-year-old offensive lineman who didn't play last year. He's going to move to guard too. I think he'll just slide in and take over for Zach Fulton's spot at guard. And you'll keep Howard at right tackle and Tunsil at left tackle. And I think he'll be pretty good there, especially if you do more like a power running style where he's like really good at like strong combo blocks. His pass, blocking worked, not because he was particularly good, but because Tom Brady was his quarterback. And when the ball is down like 1.7 seconds, like I think I could walk in, pass protect a little bit for Tom Brady, and the ball is out that quickly like it was in New England too. So I think Can's fine. But the thing about the Can trade was weird was like if you are rebuilding, you don't want to swap picks,
Yeah.
Like it didn't make very much sense to swap picks if you're going to be a 4-12 team, with New England. Maybe the idea they thought was that if Watson's around, well, we'll probably win just as many games as New England, or we'll win close as many games, and so we're not giving up a whole lot. But I think potentially like they could lose, 60 spots of draft picks cumulatively by making that trade. But I think it's just kind of bizarre considering the age, the fact that Can sat out last year, and they don't really know who their quarterback's going to be this year exactly, especially from us, like from an external view as well too. But I think both those trades were fine. The Lawson move was probably the best move they made this year, and then also I think signing Jackson and Lindsey, like those are legitimate NFL players, and those are the type of contracts like if you want to go, or a good idea for the way the team is built right now. And I think like that's an example of they could have done that move probably like 8 more times with real actual NFL players instead of the players that they got. And we would be thinking a lot differently about, I guess, the Texans offseason right now at the moment, too, if they did that as well.
Yeah, because, they've just signed Chris Conley, who, was a guy who, coming out of Georgia in 2015, was a guy that blew up the combine. He's 6'3", or listed at 6'3". Didn't quite play like that. He's obviously a guy who's probably known for being a sort of a freak athlete in a sense, and I assume he's the kind of idea to fill that extra receiver spot, but which they don't really have. And again, you said the David Culley offense. We don't know what that is, and I don't think he knows what it is either, to be honest, because he just talks about calling plays or running systems that the personnel dictates, which again is the antithesis of Bill O'Brien and the previous regime, because he was shoehorning and overpaying people to make his scheme work, and so they've gone the complete opposite in that sense. But I think there's a lot, there is a lot of holes on this roster, but we quite clearly don't have a possession receiver, and I think we probably, we don't have an edge rusher, and I don't think we have an outside boundary cover corner. So I think, and it's probably all these things are list of 1A, 2A, B, C that you'd want when you're building a team. And I just think when you look at the fundamental building blocks of this team, we've not added to it in any way. Okay, it's nice to pick up a slot corner in Desmond King that can be an admirable player in this league. As you said, if you want 3 pass rushers and Lawson's their cleanup guy, sets the edge well, he can rush at times if he gets the right matchup, but he's a bit inconsistent. So I think the team, for me, Matt, I think there's just a lot of holes, and I don't think they did anything through free agency to fill that in any way.
Yeah, and I agree with that too. And like again, like it lacks like the upside of getting like younger, kind of more interesting players with some sort of talent that's on earth. Like I think we know who a lot of these guys are, except for Desmond King. I think there's some potential there. I think we know if Lindsey's like a legitimate running back, and also like if you sign good players or like talented players, they also offer the opportunity to that you could trade them. You're on the trade deadline. You see that a lot in baseball, where guys sign like a 1-year contract and they get traded the trade deadline and then become a prospect or two, and then maybe you get something out of kind of like nothing at all whatsoever. And so I do think like King offers that. I think Lindsey offers that, but I don't think Kevin Pierre-Louis offers that. I think that's something else that was kind of not earth there as well too. And I'm very dumb. I accidentally called Desmond King Jackson earlier. It's Desmond King who I was alluding to earlier. So do you want to talk about the Laramie Tunsil restructure? Because he's due $26 million next year and the year after. And I know you kind of alluded to it a few times as well. I think it's a very kind of bizarre decision as well too, like we've kind of talked already about before.
Yeah, I mean, my first inclination was, well, he'd be an easy one to restructure because he's his own agent. So he's not as busy as other people's agents are, and they're trying to get their clients jobs. So they looked along the list. I think I saw Texans cap put out, you can save $7 million on Cunningham, again converting it to signing bonus, which is great that Cal's happy to pay the money out. But it's not a way. I think kicking money down the road is just another example of we don't know what the strategy is.
Yeah, and it doesn't make sense too if you are rebuilding, because now it limits how much money you can spend next year, the year after. Like, you would rather front load those contracts and pay those guys now, and that way you have less money to spend later on whenever the salary cap goes up, whenever you have a good football team and you have holes that you need to fill as well too. And it's like Tunsil has a cap of like $9.2 million this year. It goes up to $26 million next year, and then it goes up to $26 million in 2023 in the last year of his contract. And it's absurd and it's insane to pay an offensive tackle $26 million. And like, they made this decision to create cap space for this year so they could, sign more players, more bad veterans. I'm not exactly sure what they're going to use a little bit of money, or that money was just created so that way they can sign the players that they already have agreed to contract terms with already. But it just doesn't make any sense at all to me to create cap space for the type of players they signed this year, and even regardless to do that anyways at all this year, whenever this team is probably going to be a 4 or 5 win team. And the second thing too is it completely removes any possibility of maybe trading Laremy Tunsil as well, because you can't trade Laremy Tunsil if he's due $26 million the year after. And then also they convert all of his salary into bonus that they'd be paying a dead cap hit of $25 million next year if they decide to trade him as well too. And it closes the door on that completely as well, that Tunsil's going to be here for all of this year, and then he'll be here all of this year, because you would actually lose $26 million if you did trade him this upcoming season, and you could possibly trade him next year, but it's kind of one of those weird kind of spots as well too.
Okay, so they can't trade him on this. There's a dead cap hit if they trade him because of the signing bonus. Is that right?
Yeah, so you have to pay the entire bonus now.
Yeah.
So they would have to pay $26 million all at once. If they trade him in 2022, they would have to take on $16 million, but he has a base salary of $17 million, and so it kind of balances itself out that you only have a hit of $1 million. So it works itself out where you cannot trim it all this year at all whatsoever, but you could possibly trim next year or the year after. But the team that trades would be having to take on that salary of $18 million to do so.
Okay. I must have misread some of that, because I thought when I first saw it and they said he's only due a base of $900K this year, that I thought, well, maybe that's a prerequisite to trade him, because that's if you pay signing bonus now, or you pay the lump sum money up front, then the team takes a minimal cap hit for a top 3 or 5 left tackle in pass protection. Definitely not in run blocking, that's for sure. It just doesn't even look like he's interested at times in run blocking. But okay.
Yeah, and that would just be for this year. Yeah. So it's like whenever you make a trade, the team has to pay the signing bonus amount, and the team that takes on the player has to pay the guaranteed money amount. And so now, because he has a $26 million signing bonus, you have to pay that $26 million right away. And the team that takes him on has to pay the guaranteed money for it. And so you can't trade him all this year, but you could trade him next year, because whenever you remove his actual contract off the books, it balances out that $16 million signing bonus that remains on there too. And so it closes the door on that. What stance are you on for Laremy Tunsil? Like, would you be open to wanting to move him this year if you could get a mid-first round pick potentially? Or are you the standpoint that Tunsil's a left tackle? You can have these guys for 12 more years. He's only 26. He's at the prime of his career coming up, and he's completely worth $20 million a season at that position.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think you saw at times you need. You don't need a guy in that position. I'd much rather have 5 average to above average guys working really well together, in sync, well coached, than I would go out and trade 2 years worth of picks. And look, picks are great because but you might pick up an Isaiah Wynn, so it can go either way. But I think it's one of those things you can have him here for 10 years and still play at a really good level. But with all the mess that's going on, you've got to think at some point, a player of his caliber might think, well, actually, I might want to go and catch on somewhere. I've got a chance to get a ring. And if Watson goes, then it's a fair assumption that the next 10 years will not be successful for this franchise. So therefore, actually, by not trading him now, when you probably could benefit from that pick, certainly from now and then into the medium term, then you're probably missing the opportunity to do that, because, as he said, as he gets longer into his short extension that he signed when he had all the leverage in the world, then you're probably missing that window again. Just like the Watson thing before the allegations, you've missed that window now, because that's kind of confined you to not being able to trade him. So it's a tough one. But end of the day, this team won 11 games with Julian Davenport left tackle. A personal favourite of yours. So
yeah,
so I think he's, and I say the Colts have brought him in, but I think it was heavy-handed management. I mean, it was being played today. You don't want to go in it and how they acquired him. I think the fact that you've now spent that and acquired him, the only way you justify that over a longer period of time is you keep him. But if somebody came and said, "Look, we'll give you a first round pick and I don't know, a third or something plus a player," would you take it? I think you'd have to, based on the situation this team's in. But if that contract renegotiation makes it impossible, then it's obviously not in their plans. But what their plans are, I don't think anybody really knows.
Yeah, and they also were committed to every player that they traded for the past 2 years as well, whether it was David Johnson or Brandon Cooks or for both those moves that were made. And so it didn't really seem like they would trade Laremy Tunsil at all. But I do think if you're a 5-win football team, your left tackle isn't going to dramatically improve your win-loss record. And also, like we've talked about before, your offensive line is about the entire group that you have, and the quarterback and the offensive scheme that you run is more indicative of the sacks that you have and the pressure rate that you have than your offensive line's pass protection itself. And I think the offensive line has a lot more to do with the run game than pass protection. And the Texans, even with Laremy Tunsil, they were bottom in the league in pressure rate in 2019. Watson was one of the most sacked quarterbacks, one of the most hit quarterbacks in 19 and 20, even with Laremy Tunsil. And they've had problems across the entirety of the offensive line. And one left tackle doesn't completely transform an entire offensive line. He doesn't make an offensive line good all on his own. And we've seen that with Tunsil, where he hasn't made a dramatic impact, and the results haven't been there from a run blocking or pass protection standpoint at all once the entire time he's been here too. And so I do think if they could have gotten the Indy's first round pick or Jacksonville's second first round pick, pick number 23 from Seattle, because they franchise tag Cam Robinson. He has been very good. And I could not imagine a world where the Colts actually start Tevy at left tackle, because he's a complete abomination at that position. And I think he would lead to Carson Wentz having at least 10 fumbles next year if he starts at that spot. But I think both those teams were the opportunity to make that trade. Maybe if you even got a second round pick and then another second round pick in 2022, that could potentially be worth it, because in a rebuilding team, draft capital is the most important resource. And so I was completely open to it. I wanted to see it happen. That's not going to happen now this year. It could happen next year. That door's open for that to happen next season. But it did still seem very bizarre to create salary cap space for this season when it really wasn't needed at all, and then have to pay more money next year and the year after. And if it comes down to that point, Houston will probably just extend him to a long-term contract to less than that $26 million cap hit. If you decide to actually stay here and do that. But it didn't really make any sense at all, though, to restructure Tunsil's contract to kick that can down the road for a team that doesn't need to create space to win now at all by any means.
Yeah, and I think I suppose it seemed implausible that you'd offer somebody $22 million over 3 years with the contract structure. And when the Trent Williams deal, and you talk about the free agency being suppressed this year, even when you actually saw the Trent Williams deal, it was almost 2 contracts. It was $23 million a year on the final 2 years, but the front 3 years were a figure lower than somewhere around the $21 million a year mark, or even lower than that, actually, I think, from memory. But it was split into 2, quite clear sections. So even sort of, a year or so on, that $22 million a year in isolation is still not being eclipsed. And to think you're going to pay him that 26 it's just not feasible. And the salary cap will jump, but this 182.5 has been borrowed from future years, and you've seen historically that the league has only jumped it up in steps. So they're not going to just suddenly jump it up $20 million a year, and then that allows you to pay one player $26 million. But a left tackle doesn't win you games. And I think that's the reality of it. A transcendent wide receiver, a transcendent running back, all these guys who you can actually acquire for far, you could acquire two of those for the same value that you acquired Tunsil for. I think, as good as what he does, I just don't think he wins you games. But the two second round picks, a bit of Matt Schaub trade value there. I quite like that. But that wasn't that long ago. 2 seconds could get you a quarterback who was serviceable in this league.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of overall free agency, what do you think? What would you rather, Matt? That you go after 3 or 4 swing and misses, Aaron Colvins, Brock Osweilers? You tried, you thought you had it right. You put the money in, it didn't work out, and then you had to get out of it, albeit expensively. Or would you rather just stockpile players as if we're in a flood and we're needing sandbags?
Yeah, I mean, I think for what the Texans are this year, I think Caserio had the right idea by signing a wide variety of players to short-term contracts like he did, rather than go all in on 1 or 2 players at all. But I wish he signed good players instead. And I do think it didn't really seem like they would actually go all in on the defense at all, even though they had needs at pass rusher and cornerback. But they could have made it. I don't know. It's I think Corey Davis would have been interesting because they don't have a tall physical receiver. I think after Fuller was released by the Bears, I think he would have been interesting in Houston, but it seemed like he just went play for Vic Fangio again. And so I don't think this offseason really kind of set itself up for Houston to be in the run for big names that required large contracts at all. But I do think Caserio took the right approach, and the overall right strategies just kind of depend on where you are in your team's life cycle. But I do wish Caserio just signed good players instead of underwhelming bomb and roster turning players instead.
Yeah, because if you look at it, who's going to play the one tech in that four-man front? Because I don't know. I don't think he's on the roster yet.
I guess Brandon Dunn, maybe. They haven't cut him yet.
Yeah.
He's still there. So I think it would probably be him and Collins,
Yeah, which doesn't really excite
and
you much
PJ
about
Hall,
if this run defense is going to be improved.
Yeah, and then you guess PJ Hall probably plays 3, and then you probably have Omenehu and Lawson as every down players. And then sub packages, you have Whitney Merciless and Jacob Martin and Janoris Jenkins, or not Janoris Jenkins, but Jenkins has just signed as well too. And so I think they have I don't know, they have a lot of players in the front 7, but how they exactly fit, I think is going to be kind of weird to see.
Well, that's the thing as well. I think when you've got unprecedented turnover in terms of numbers, the coaching staff, considering they're going to have a confined off-season program again as COVID still lingers, that's still going to define schedules. There's going to be more, digital contact time. You're not going to be in the classroom. You're not going to have as many much time in the practice field as you would have in traditional years. It's going to be really difficult for this new coaching staff to get across a new scheme, partly on one side of the ball and supposedly some iterations on the offensive side of the ball, and how they're going to do that with a new quarterback. I don't think you can feasibly have any expectations when you've got a head coach who's effectively a caretaker, lovely guy, but he's not necessarily here to win football games. And you've got just turnover upon turnover. And look, I do like the fact that we're moved away from we like our guys, because that saddled us to too many players for too long. And the turnover in an element is good, but I think the turnover is too high to the point where actually that may well impact the roster. It's fine for special teams. It's fine for the bottom 5 or 6 spots on a 53. But when you've got 33 spots to turnover, that's going to be a lot for the coaching staff to try and decipher and try and get an element of cohesion by the time they hit the field come September. And I think they're going to need those preseason games and they're going to hope that they'll be back up and running this year.
Yeah, I think they'll play preseason this year, and I'm not all that concerned about the amount of roster turnover, just because of a lot of these guys are bad that were there. Whether it's so you have Kevin Pierre-Louis instead of Tyrell Adams, and instead of having Vernon Hargreaves starting outside cornerback, you have Terrence Mitchell out there instead for as long as possible, as long as that lasts. And so it really is just hard from this standpoint, with just a wide collection of names and players, to have kind of any idea how exactly they're going to fit, who's going to perform well this summer and who's going to actually step up and be able to win kind of some of these position spots too. And even kind of talking about the defensive line, we already forgot about Ross Blacklock. He's still on this team after his completely and Jonathan Greener too, and like Blackard and Blacklock had zero. He had more punches thrown than sacks last year. He had I think 2 quarterback hits, and Collins had 1 quarterback hit last year and 0 sacks over the course of the 500 snaps that he played last season too. And so it really just kind of reminds me of that scene in The Dark Knight where the Joker breaks the pool cue and throws it to 5 people just for them to beat each other to death and figure out who's going to play. And I think that's kind of what the Texans' idea is going to be this summer, to just have an open competition, see who wins, and then roll with them from there, and then cut the rest of these guys before the final 53-man roster comes up.
Yeah, it's a rather expensive tryout, I think, of failed veteran, mid to lower tier players. I think it probably, if you were looking for reasons to have enthusiasm, I don't, beyond the naivety of clapping everything that Caserio does, then yeah, you've probably lost, any signs of new hope that this team could be any better. I assume, Matt, we're in agreement that Tyron Taylor starts week 1, whether it be suspension, holdout, or the unlikely trade. What do you actually see this team looking like between now, or what do you see the moves they make between now and the draft? Just generally, I'm not asking about players, but what do you think they're going to do to try and get this team ready beyond this bunch of Caserio recruits that he's amassed at great cost and a great number of new names on the roster?
Yeah, I think because unlike other teams, I think a lot of teams after the first week of free agency, they're kind of like set still and they kind of know where they have holes and try to figure out like where they need to improve at in the NFL draft that comes up, and they kind of like feel like they have some idea of what their roster is going to be. I think for Houston, I think despite all the additions they have, they really have no idea what their roster what their roster is going to consist of whenever they come up to their 53-man cuts and everything else. And so, I mean, I can still see them adding more veteran players. I can still see them making decisions to bring additional guys on short contracts like they've been doing as well too before the draft. So I don't think the Texans are done by any means, until the last weekend of April. Between now and then, I still think the door is open for them to make some additional signings to kind of keep doing what they've been doing for the past week or so.
Yeah, and I think I think you're just going to see a churn, and I hope that you throw enough darts at the board and a couple of them will stick, and you pick up those guys, you run with them longer term, and then you've created your guys. They're not inherited guys. Do you see any more cuts? I know you touched on Brandon Dunn there, but do you think any more cuts or any more restructures? Because they're going to have to find, I think there's still about 5 or 6 million over the cap based on the reported signings. As you said, they're going to keep coming.
Yeah, that I mean, I would think so. I don't really want to. I don't want to get hurt my own feelings by saying they're going to cut Conley Warren or anything like that. I think it'd be kind of interesting to be like
if
they cut
today actually as well. So
yeah, I know. I gotta send him a text message and wish him happy birthday. I'm excited to be able to play pool volleyball with Conley all summer as he gets ready for the 2021 season. But it'd be interesting to see if they actually cut some of these guys they just signed, like if they just cut Mark Ingram already. I think that'd be interesting because they got Philip Lindsay instead, and like see them already kind of piggyback and kind of go back on some of the decisions they already made. Because I think the opportunity is there as well too. Be like, oh, we actually had this idea, we executed it, and then realized this was the wrong idea, and there's still there are better players that we could sign for the same sort of contract. So I think that would be interesting. They're able to do that. But I think the 3 biggest guys are Brandon Dunn. Number 2 is Whitney Merciless. I do think Jenkins offers Caserio as like an exit strategy from Merciless if they decide just pay the $3 million and in the salary cap hit they're going to have they decide cut Merciless. And Eric Murray's the other guy too, because like Murray, you only save $1 million if you cut him, but he's not good at anything at all whatsoever. They tried him in pretty much every role in their defense last year, whether it was him playing slot corner or linebacker or deep middle, or have him playing as the second deep safety, and he was bad at every single one of those spots too. And so I do think I do think there's an opportunity for Eric Murray to be released also. But kind of the biggest things I would like to see some of these guys who they just signed just to kind of flat out release some of these guys and create cap space, because I think that'd be kind of very funny at the same time, being kind of like the right move to make after we kind of know what the talent level is and some of the other players are available at the same time too.
Yeah, because you saw that they've just released Anthony Kavuka and they've brought or they're reported to bring back John Weeks after after a sort of 2-week period of thinking, the longest tenure player in franchise history, or the current longest tenure player in franchise for the franchises, he's coming back. So you've seen him already do that. What do you think was worse, signing Derek Rivers, a man who used to be infamously married twice, or bringing back Vernon Hargreaves?
Hargreaves for sure. Like Hargreaves is like an act of war. It's like they're just completely just messing around with us at this point. And like even like if you want to make the argument that Hargreaves is a fine like depth signing, even that doesn't make sense because the thing about depth is that sometimes you have to use that depth. And the Texans have one competent cornerback in Bradley Roby. They don't have anybody else aside from that. And so if your depth is Vernon Hargreaves, it might mean that you're probably going to play Vernon Hargreaves sometime last year. And him starting 16 games outside corner was completely putrid. He was awful at that spot. The one, like, not a spot at all they could play in all whatsoever. Like, he, like, barely held on as a slot cornerback the year before. And, like, he was fine in the sense of he was, life raft because you have the cornerback injuries and the Aaron Colvin problem that happened earlier in the season. So, I provide, like, some level, I guess, of, performance from a veteran free agent in the slot. But him starting outside cornerback all year, for them to bring him back, I think it was just like an act of war. I still can't get over it, and I can't believe it. And like I mentioned about Rivers, like I don't think Rivers is good, but that's the sort of like profile of a player that you'd want to see Houston sign. Based off the life cycle of their team, and if they do end up trading Watson, we just want to sign guys with maybe some idea of upside. Even though Rivers has never produced in his career, but he was a good prospect once upon a time, and he's had a bunch of injuries, and so maybe if he gets healthy, there's something there that. That just needs some more time to develop. And, Hargreaves doesn't offer that at all whatsoever.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it seems odd, and I think that's probably up there with the David Johnson guaranteeing $4 million for a guy who just couldn't run in. Like, as you said, the only good tape he put together was when they started running a bit more inside zone, single cut kind of stuff against bad defensive fronts towards the end of the year when games were effectively meaningless for the Texans. Okay, he did okay against Indy, but most of that was, that game on the road was through the air. But you guarantee a guy like that $4 million. Then you had the punter contract, you had all this, and that's, as you said, that's one decent player they could have had. It doesn't look like that, and I think it's great depth, but I think you're often spending money in free agency because your draft hasn't worked out the way you have. And if you look back at the 2019, obviously we've seen Cullen Gillespie was cut. If you think back to that draft class of Brian Gain, really only Titus Howard and Charles Omeni who have worked out to a degree. Max Sharpen, big year for him. Lonnie Johnson, big year for him in year 3. Your 2020 draft class is almost in the year 2 is an unknown because we just didn't see the guys on the field. Despite not having any picks, how big do you think this draft is in 21 just to find even solid role players, which is something they haven't done at least 3 or 4 spots? Because if you start to go 3 draft classes without some form of shape of a roster, I think that's when you start to run into a lot of problems with your team. And actually, you think if this year's not going to actually move us any forward, one of the few things I think you could take out of 2021 is you could find some good young players. So I think this draft class for me they've got to find ways to build depth and solid role players at the very least.
Yeah, it's weird now for Houston because they used to be a team that was built on first round draft picks that hit, and they're built on top talent, and they can never kind of find like the depth overall to replace guys who got hurt. Like Kevin Pierre-Louis would have been great for the 2012 Texans. So instead of Barrett Ruud covering Aaron Hernandez on the flat, you have Kevin Pierre-Louis out there instead. And so I think for the Texans it's a little bit different now, where they don't have that top talent at all whatsoever anymore. Like they're just overall just pretty bad roster now. With the decisions that Caserio has recently made, with the fact that they haven't had the lack of first round pick and second round pick they had last year, the fact that Max Sharping and Lonnie Johnson Jr. both been really bad. Howard's been like a really good pass blocker, last year at times, but he's not a very good run blocker at all. Kind of like you mentioned with Tunsil, where there's a lot of times where he doesn't even look like he wants to even be on the field at all whenever they call a run play too. And so I think they're a little bit different now for Houston, where I think it's kind of just like it's not really finding role players all anymore. It's just trying to get like any level of talent at all whatsoever. And so I'm kind of more interested in them rather than getting these guys who are like, smart and have good fundamentals, have played the game. I think they're in a position now where they just need to try to get high upside, try to get athleticism, and try to do everything they can just to get talent now. Because their way their roster is composed is completely flipped because of the excess of top talent they've seen, since the 2018 season. And so I do think that's kind of the way that they need to look about this. And I think the other thing makes me somewhat excited for Nick Caserio being the general manager is I think the Texans just need a lot of picks. So like similar to free agency, where they sign ton players, I think that's the idea behind the NFL draft as well too. Is I think the best way to do it will probably be to trade down as much as they can, try to see if there's any way to turn some veteran players into picks as well too, and just try to get try to cast as wide of a net as possible despite the limited draft capital that they currently have. I think that's the two things that they should look for whenever the draft kicks off next month.
Yeah, and they've just got to find, to find Caserio's philosophy. Will they take risks on character guys, which they historically haven't done, perhaps their detriment? Do they go and jump up and take guys, or do they just keep trading back to amass picks? But the problem is they've not really got any, apart from their first pick in the third. They've obviously given up one of their fourth round draft picks to New England back for a fifth. Mm-hmm. So, they've not got many picks that are really going to acquire you maybe one or two picks extra, in that region of the draft that they're going to be able to spread the risk on the picks. So it's good. It's a murky old off season. I think we just don't know what's going on with your quarterback, legal issues aside, and you've got a new backup style Tyron Taylor coming in with, as you said, just the complete erosion of top end talent is tough. And I think it goes back to that adage of who do you put on the program, because there's not many.
Yeah, I guess you don't put anybody on the program. Is the answer to that?
Yeah.
What do you think about Tyron Taylor? Like, are you excited to watch 16 games with Tyron Taylor this year, or would you kind of want them to sign somebody else, at least have a more kind of entertaining aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you can't trade Watson, it is Tyrod, isn't it, for 16? No, not really. I don't think anybody could be excited about a guy who's been a career backup, and he had that one good year in Buffalo, and they'll point to that. And David Culley was involved, and I remember watching the playoff game where they got there. And do you remember the game where they went up to Jacksonville?
Yeah, they lost 10-3.
And they took a hell of a crowd with them. It was almost, there was more Buffalo fans inside that terrible stadium with the swimming pools than there was Jacksonville fans, and it seemed like it was all set up for a romantic return to the playoffs, win a game, and the offense that they put out against it. Oh, don't get me wrong, that was a good Jacksonville defense, but on the big stage, it wasn't very good, and I think you saw he was limited in that sense. He got them through a season. I think it was it was either 9 or 10 wins. I can't remember how many they had that year, but it was a bit like, when Fitzpatrick was here, and, it was a guy who was quite likable. He gave his all, and actually probably the Texans moved on from Fitzpatrick when they shouldn't have, to go down the Hoyer Mallet route. But I think it's going to be a plucky season, but the Fitzpatrick season, I think, when you think about it as a quarterback who was giving it all, he's limited. But you had a really strong defense which transcended talent players, reasonably speaking, at the height of their powers. So you could balance out the offense and efficiency. But I just think now if we go with a Deshaun Watson-less team, who's then grossly inefficient on offense, added that to defense, you're looking at a number 1 overall draft pick, which then I think a number 1 overall draft pick is something to get excited about. But you've just got to embrace that slog, I think, because what's probably been disheartening about the whole Deshaun trade was all this offseason you kind of talked a bit about the game, and then you went, well, who do you think is going to be the new head coach? Who do you think is going to be the new general manager? And it was going to be, everything was going to be flipped. But actually all we've done is really taken a sidestep, and it feels like things have got worse.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing about Taylor. It's like Taylor, I think, his best skill is that he doesn't throw interceptions. I think his current interception rate is 1.4%. And like he can run that sort of power run offense, and they decide to kind of like go the Baltimore offensive route where they run, a gap read offense. I think he could do some work there. But the thing about it, though, and the big problem is that the defense is awful. And so it's like you can't you run this ball control sort of offense where you're going to be able to kind of turn the clock and be able to win games close with the defense that the Texans have on the other side of the field. Like you can't win games 13-10 with Taylor like maybe a different team could possibly do too. And like I think Taylor's just kind of he's pretty boring to watch, And so I love that term that you just said, embrace the slog, because I think that's exactly what the 2021 season is going to be with Taylor. I think it's going to be very boring, and the defense is going to be really bad, and they're going to lose a lot of games like 30-10 and 30-13, where like Taylor doesn't make mistakes, but they just run the ball and punt a lot, And I think like you could have a season where Lindsey, David Johnson, Ingram, and Tyron Taylor, they probably combine and run the ball 40 times a game potentially, And so I think it's the type of year that we're in for with him out there. And like, there's no like element of upside. Taylor had a chance. Like he was interesting in Buffalo because whenever Greg Roman was their offensive coordinator, they actually had a top 10 offense for 2 years in Buffalo. But Rex Ryan completely ruined their defense by trying to go to his 3-4, make it super blitz heavy, and he killed like their front four pressure they had going on for so well, and like ruined Mario Williams' career there by making that switch to make him a stand-up linebacker. They would have been a Super Bowl contending team with Greg Roman and anybody else aside from Rex Ryan, the entire world, calling the defense that they did. And so it was cute that he had like one playoff run, and he got hurt in Cleveland the year his first year there. He got hurt with the Chargers last year and didn't get the chance to start at all whenever he was coming into the year as a starter because of injuries. And so I think he may be cursed where he can't start more than 1 week. And we may see, Ryan Finley out here pretty quickly, which would be, I think, a lot more fun because at least there's that element of like grotesqueness to it that can be enjoyable too. But I think with Taylor, I think like this is still going to be a 4 or 5 win team. It doesn't elevate that. You don't have a playoff team here at all whatsoever, Taylor. And I think it's just going to be a very boring like 4 or 5 win season. Whereas if you have somebody, who's maybe a little bit younger, a little bit more fun to watch, that may be a better season,
Yeah, and I think the element of just watching the Taylor games go out, and it's a tough situation, right? I just think it's going to be a tough year. It's going to be so similar to last year in the sense that it was you're kind of just hoping to turn the page before it's even started, which is counterproductive, I think, for fandom and the team to generally sell themselves. And there was actually an interview recently of David Culley, and I think it was to Texas media, and he said, if we have to go 3 and out and punt the ball, that's okay. And you think, how are you going to sell that to anybody? And I just that's the bit that I don't get, and the bit that I don't think anybody understands. Because, and he also said as well, and look, I've hardly talked about the David Culley or the coaching staff on this podcast because I just don't think there's any point. But just taking that comment, and then the comment was that he said, I don't know if I'll win a game here. And you think, all right, okay, good, okay. And then he's also come out with comments, around, I was brought here, and he said he went into the interview without a sheet of paper, and he also said, I was brought here because I was the best guy for this situation. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, he's here to. Well, I think what he means by that is he's here to take the team to the pizza buffet after they lose 31-10. Like, I didn't think Watson was going to be traded until they hired David Culley, and then once they hired Culley, it's like, well, they're going to trade Watson, and Culley is here to increase like his pension whenever he retires from the NFL, and then he's here to be able to keep morale high because he does seem like a really enjoyable person to be around. I would like to play football for David Culley. I like to go eat pizza with David Culley. I like to go to the team prayer circles to David Culley. Like, he seems like a really like bright and like fun to be around person. And so I think that's what his goal here is he's just here to keep morale high, during a rebuild. And then whenever the Texans have, potentially a good team, maybe in 2023 or whenever that actually could happen again, depending on, what Nick Caserio does between now and then, you get a different head coach who actually has the ability to, scheme a really good offense or scheme a really good defense and get the most out of his players and iron down that aspect of coaching instead of just being like really sweet and really loving and really enjoyable to be around, and getting the most out of these players as people, not necessarily as what they do on the field itself.
And he's the kind of guy that I think would be great as like a church caretaker or a leader of a local community centre that, an outreach program or something like that, that everybody knows and respects and not got a bad word to say about him and does a great job, but is underappreciated. I think his career's been a bit like that. But I just would love to know when this is all said and done, and all those years when Caserio was sitting there slogging, doing 20+ hour days in Foxborough, and he's thinking to himself, when I get my chance finally, I'm going to hire David Culley. I don't. Do you know? And I think I would love to know who he wanted to hire, or if all things were equal, who he would have hired, because I know he came in and he sparked the issue with Watson, and there are probably 101 reasons that will never come to the light of day. But why did they not just go out and hire the best football coach they possibly could? Because they didn't do that, and I think that point then just has a knock-on effect. And this is why you're just stacking linebackers and players that are all, well, unquestionably not good enough to be starting players in pro football. And it's just kind of had that knock-on effect with that. I'd love to know who he in his heart of hearts would have wanted if this was a level playing field he came in, because Cal and Easterby basically didn't let him start this on a level footing, and they're basically kind of passing it over to him to clear up while they hide in the background.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think that kind of lends itself to with some of the decisions they made this offseason, where like Nick Caserio has said, a lot of times that, well, Jack Easterby's great at things and he's not going to have a role in football operations. And they always say too, like our goal is to communicate clearly, and every chance they've had to communicate clearly about what Jack Easterby does, they completely fail to do so at all whatsoever. But I do think that the Coley hiring is like the perfect Jack Easterby sort of guy. I think he's a Jack Easterby tweet, brought to life. I think he's the exact opposite of Bill O'Brien. I think, like you mentioned, he's a caretaker, But it does seem like there's kind of like a schism in the Texans where it's like, these are football moves, and then this is something weird that happened, and this is something weird that happened that still lends itself to Jack Easterby having some sort of role in football decisions, and whether it's keeping David Johnson here for another year, or or whether it's David Coley being hired as the head coach instead of somebody who can actually like develop a really great offense to build around Deshaun Watson, and then be able to have like a spread offense that the Texans are built around for the next 7 years or so while he has his mobility. Like, rather than make a decision like that to go about the Texans offseason, they instead got Nick Caserio, got Easterby's guy, got a head coach who's just like Jack Easterby, and have made decisions that are kind of like Easterby sort of decisions, while they've said, the exact opposite every time they have the opportunity to do so. And so, like, it is weird. Like, there's definitely like a conflict, and it's kind of like the blue and the red part of the Texans logo. It's kind of like what the Texans currently have right now with how they're being run at the same time too.
Yeah, because it's like they make moves and then they give David Johnson the money and they go, actually, we'll take on Philip Lindsay. We'll sign Rivers. Oh no, actually Jenkins is a much better player. Let's bring him in. And I had this image in my head of Easterby going, "Oh, Nick, I've done this," and going, "Oh, well, we're gonna have to fix that," And I don't understand for the life of me why he's only going to have one shot at this. This is probably going to be his only ever general manager gig. Why he would want to endanger that, but I think that probably speaks to the manipulation and the influence that Easterby can just so masterfully influence on it. And I had this thought today, and we'll wrap up on this, Matt, but how different do you think it would have been if Caserio had been hired when Bill O'Brien was still here, when the first time they tried to pursue him before they got filed for tampering?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like, it's definitely a completely alternate reality, like even how much different the Texans would be if they didn't fire Brian Gaine, that year as well too. We're just like, you have some sort of level of like competency and, intelligence at the position, and like, I don't know if Brian Gaine was a bad general manager necessarily. Like, I do think he did a poor job of spending their free agency money that offseason, but not signing some like Sheldon Richardson, not doing everything they could to get the most out of Deshaun Watson's actual rookie contract. I think his draft was, pretty good considering the fact that they didn't have a first round pick at all, and or a second round pick that year. And so, like, I do think that he had a fairly good draft. Like, he got Justin Reed. I still like Crowley Ward, like, more than a meme, like, from a talent perspective. I'm still interested to see what happens to Martinez Rankin. Like, I know he had a bad injury last year in Kansas City whenever he was a star there as well too. And so like I still like even if they kept him, I don't know how much of it was Gaines' fault and how much of it was O'Brien's fault and what their long-term outlook and strategy kind of came together. But like with Caserio, I do think one, who knows if they would have traded, Clowney or if they would have traded, Hopkins. But I do think if they would have made those decisions, he would have at least been able to get like a first round pick or, actually like a really good player for those decisions instead of a third round pick and Barkevius Mingo and, Jacob Martin and a third round pick that became, Gary and Conley. Or if they decide to trade DeAndre Hopkins, they would have got first round pick like the Vikings got when they traded Stephon Diggs instead of a second round pick and, David Johnson and like a pick swap where they were able to, get Brandon Cooks to take Ross Blacklock. So I do think they would have gotten more value out there. I think they wouldn't have fallen the same offensive line issues that they fell into in 2019 before the Laremy Tunsil trade happened, where the team they consciously went into that season in 2019 where they wouldn't have Matt Khalil being the starting left tackle, despite him being bad for the previous 4 or 5 years and him being injured, all that time before that too. And so I don't think the Tunsil trade happens. I think the other two trades happen. They at least get more value or competent value for those decisions that are made. I think those are kind of the three big spots where maybe the team is different too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's probably been many points along the way where you thought, I wish, you probably wish you'd have savoured the good moments a bit more, I think, because I always felt like you were on the crest of being a competent playoff caliber football team, and you had a bit of a glass ceiling above your head just because it's offensive scheme and some personnel decisions, and now you think, you'd give what you'd give to go back to sort of 10-6,
or just even like the opportunity they had. Like I think that was kind of the worst thing about the Bill O'Brien era. Like even though they were 10-6, even though they went to the playoffs, like I still don't think they were a very fun team to watch. Like I felt like every time we were watching a Texans game that there was a better team that existed that we weren't able to watch because Bill O'Brien was the head coach. And it was very like different than, the Texans team in like 2011, 2012, where those teams, I think Gary Kubiak got like the most possible he could have got out of those teams. And it didn't work out well in 12. Schaub's arm fell apart. He broke his foot in 11. But like, they at least were like, they played up to their like utmost performance, Whereas I think with Houston, the past 4 years since they drafted Deshaun Watson, even before that by kicking the quarterback decision down the road and wasting a really great defense all those years. I think the difference between that time and those times earlier in the decade is that there was a really great football team out there. There was a Super Bowl caliber team out there. Yeah. And instead we were stuck watching this team that was giving the ball to Carlos Hyde 25 times a game, that was giving the ball to Alfred Blue 40 times a game, that was still running like this play action, like drag flat, repass option offense instead of push small downfield Deshaun Watson, and watching a team that could score 40 points a game that was instead really starving and really straining itself to score 27 points a game that finished the positive UA once during Bill O'Brien's entire tenure. I think that's like the frustrating thing, because I do think like, in the upcoming years, while a team is 4-12 or 2-14, whatever happens, there's gonna be that kind of sentiment that like, oh, I wish we enjoyed that time a lot more, or y'all really didn't appreciate how good that time was. I don't think it was very, very particularly good. I think it was very frustrating, underwhelming, and it should have been a lot better, but we just didn't have the opportunity for it to be better because of who the head coach was.
Yeah, I think you touched on the Matt Schaub there when he did the quarterback sneak in Tampa and he got hurt, and you thought that's our chance going that year. There's been other times like that. You think the Mario Williams injury in Watt's rookie year, you didn't get to see them play together. There's been lots of moments you think just if that had happened, we might have been okay. And I think the Jacoby Jones fumble in Baltimore as well in 2012. Even though you got TG Yates out there, you got a defense to keep you in the game, and that just pushed that game away for you. But I don't think, in saying 10, 15 years time, I don't think you'll ever look back on a game with more regret, considering you were teeing yourself up for a home game against Tennessee when you're 24 points up on the road, when you should have gone for it on that fourth down, when you should have just punted rather than trying to run a fake punt, when you shouldn't have had DeAndre Carter back there and he fumbles. Just
Mm-hmm.
3 all very controllable decisions. Even if you get 1, maybe 2 right, you don't start and look, the game might have been close. They might have lost it late in the fourth quarter, and you could have probably lived with that. But that 24-point lead, I don't think you'll never have highs like that. I don't think there's ever been as many highs watching that game. And they racked up scores quickly. Kenny Stills runs down untouched in the end zone. You block a punt. You get a turnover. And all these things, and it was just like it was all falling into place. You thought, if it doesn't happen now, it's never going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're definitely never going to happen now.
Yeah, and it's weird because that game too, that everything fell in place for them to win that game. That was a game that if you play 100 times, the Chiefs probably win 95 times or whatever. That was one of the 5 times where Houston was set up to win that game, and never during the entirety of that game was oh, they got this at all, just because of how bad that pass defense was and how pretty underwhelming that pass rush was, and the pass defense had been bad for 2 years running. They should have fixed it the year before. They didn't, but I never even felt up 24-0. Really comfortable at all, and then winning that game. And I'll always hate Bill O'Brien for kicking that field goal, like you mentioned earlier, on 4th and 1 too. I do think the most fun part though, the Bill O'Brien era, was probably in 2017 when Watson had those back-to-back games against New England, Seattle. I think that was the high point of the entire 6 and a little bit more, 6 I guess in a quarter of years he was the head coach. Because that was oh, he can run an offense that scores 31 points. They have Deshaun Watson, and this guy's the future, and he's incredible and everything else. And then he took that and then turned this into the offense that he ended up purposely creating after that, which is unbelievable as well too. But I do think that was the from an entertainment aspect, the high watermark. But I do agree with you. The closest they ever got was that Chiefs game, but I never felt comfortable or confident in that Chiefs game. And a different football team would have won that game. 41-27, that wasn't led by Bill O'Brien as the general manager and Bill O'Brien as the head coach.
Yeah, and I think this I actually watched that Seattle game at the weekend back, and I've talked about it a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
I was there, and I couldn't believe what I was watching, because I thought, this is it. And I remember walking out the stadium that day saying, and I held that assertion for right up till the end of the 2019 season as well. There's no way you won't win a Super Bowl with this quarterback. And if you'd have told me on that day in 2017 that by 2021 you'd have no good players on your roster, you'd have Watson wanting to leave, he's got 14 allegations of sexual misconduct against him in a civil court, you've got a pastor running the team, you've got Bob's passed away, and that was with the weekend. Bob's comments got misconstrued in the media. You Calv's running the team into the ground and can't even see it. It's actually quite harrowing. If you'd have told me all that then that day, I would have just laughed. You couldn't have made it up. It couldn't have gone. You probably couldn't have put it on more of a downward trajectory if you tried, but it should have been everything was possible. And it's I suppose at least we'll have the memories of maybe what could have been, but I suppose that's just sports for you, right?
Yeah. I think have this conversation with you, which I've had a really fun time this afternoon. I think what I need to go do, at least after the NFL draft, is go back and watch those 5 games that Watson starred in 2017 to just kind of remember. I didn't fully appreciate that in the moment because of how unnerving, how unexpected it was, how incredible he was during that time. But I think, and that season was kind of funny afterwards too. That second Titans game was pretty funny and all that. But I think those games, if I'm going to go back and watch some Texans games this year, I think those Watson starts in 2017 is what I'll probably do.
If you watch the game at New England and they scored just before the half, I think it's either the Bruce Ellington or they kick a field goal late in the half. I can't remember. But the camera pans to the box and Bob McNair's there. And if you look at his face, he can't quite believe what's happening either. And I think that was the moment that he thought, we've got a real one here. But maybe if his appraisal of his second born son had been a bit more forthright, we might not be in this position, Matt, I think. But yeah, it's been a fun time. As I said to you before we came on, I said just hoping we can get back to some games this year, because it's not been at games and enjoying what it is to be a Texan was always much more than the football. So I think at least you've got that to hold on to. But it's certainly going to be a long old slog, as we said. And I think slog will be very much the mantra of this team before it's going to be ugly and pretty downright awful until it gets good again. And who knows when that'll be. But
that will need to be the title of the 2021 NFL Films portion for the Houston Texans. The 2021 Texans Embrace the Slog. I have one last question for you. Are you going to keep the same podcast name now that JJ Watt's in Arizona? Are you going to stick with it still?
Well, yeah. Do you know, it was a rhetorical question, and actually reminiscing a bit here, but so there's me and three other guys. We've gone to these games right since 2012. One of my friends worked in Houston, and we went to a game, and Buffalo at home. That was Mario Williams' return game, and Fitzpatrick was at quarterback, and it just kind of grew every year, and then we started going to road games and all this kind of stuff. And I remember sitting in the airport, and we'd been, it was the Indianapolis game on the Sunday night where they won in overtime. You went up on the road. You kind of thought, actually, maybe, Osweiler's actually, could be serviceable. They ran outside zone. Lamar Miller looked good. He couldn't hit a crosser to save himself, but it was, you thought there's the guys were open. You thought it just needs to flow and be consistent rather than this sort of game plan approach. You just need to find what you're good at and stick to it. And then I remember the spiral fumble in Denver against the team that he chose not to sign signed for us instead. And just having a sort of terrible hangover on the way back from sitting in Denver airport. The flight was delayed because of weather. And it was, why did I do this to myself? And the turn up for Watt was about that rather than actually JJ Watt. It just was convenient that you could change it to the name. So it was more of a rhetorical question of what I do. Why do you do this to yourself? Because it's certainly not for the glory, and I think that will continue to be pertinent for a while. So I think we'll stick with it until we can find something else. But hopefully we can start talking about a positive football team at some point. But I think it's a long way off. But Matt, thank you very much for your time, mate.
Yeah,
really great discussion.
Yeah, it was great talking today as well too. And I think for sure, like all Texans fans have to have some level of existentialism to them to be able to keep watching, you know, year in, year out, you know.
That's it. They don't make it easy, but it's certainly interesting. There's a lot to talk about it. Matt, if anybody's not checked out any Battle Red blog, there's a lot of good guys creating a lot of content, great podcast. So go and check them out. Thank you very much for your time, Matt, and keep in touch.
Yep, have a great day.